Welcome back to Game Programming with Unity. We're back with a little bit more collection awesomeness. So what I'm going to do here in this last little segment in this section on intermediate scripting with collections and arrays is I'm going to show you how to generate a collection from game objects in the scene through code. Right? So we could of course drag and drop like we did over here, drag these over. Here we could, drag this item over to our array or even a list if it's a list, right? We can do the same thing. That's really tedious and really slow and doesn't allow us to dynamically populate those things with certain types of objects or components. So I've got a little challenge here. What I want to do is say, let's load. I've got this new script here. I'm going to turn this one off for a minute. I'm going to disable that script so that it doesn't run when I run the game. So I have a new script that I wrote here, and it'll be in this example script. It's called Game Objects to Collections. What we really want to do is say, hey, let's throw some game objects into a collection when the game starts, or as you're going to see in the lab, we're going to do it on the fly using Input Manager. So we'll generate those collections from whatever is happening in the game at that moment, which is one of the cooler things about this method of adding stuff to lists and collections is we can do it, boom, just right there on the spot. So whatever's in the scene and near us, we can throw into a collection of some kind in order to do stuff to them. So you can see I've generated one of these is a list, which is this rigid. It's called rigid. So what I want to do is compile all the rigid bodies into that list. One is the spheres, and that's going to compile all the objects in the scene containing a tag known as sphere. And lights, this is going to get all game objects in the scene as that are of the type light. So let's look at the code to see how I'm going to do this. Okay. So basically I've declared these variables. And let's see here. These variables are pretty self-explanatory, so I won't comment those. But here I'll comment these. This is get all items with game tag into spheres array. And we'll call that game object. Alright, so this first line of code, what does this do? Spheres. I've declared it up here as an array, right? Remember, an array is not dynamic. I can't add things later on, so this is somewhat limited. Alright, but arrays tend to be much faster, especially if you're working in the middle of a game, and you don't need to worry about dynamically sizing an array or a list or a collection using mutability. Then we can kind of just use this array. It's a little faster. Alright, so usually your first instinct is to use the array if you don't need to do anything complex, or you don't need to add values to that array or take them away. If you need to do some more complex stuff, or if you're not sure what the number of them is going to be, and you're going to have to change it on a regular basis, then you go with the lists. Alright, so what we've done here is spheres equals game object find objects with tag. Now what this says is every object in this scene that has this particular tag loaded up into this array, and loaded up into this array as many of these items as there are, that's how many indices there will be in the array. That will be the length of the array. So right now, in my game, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items, and all of them have the tag sphere. So let's go ahead and click on play, and we'll just close these two, and we'll get to those in a second. What did I do? Well, I loaded up every one of these items here inside of my array, right, with the matching length, because it's going to take all those values in. So I'm dynamically sizing an array, which I said you can't do, but you can do if it's the first time you declare the values of that array to be a list of something else. I can't later on remove one of those or add it back, right? I can only change the number of slots in that array when I first give it a value, right? And an array value is a number of slots that in turn have values. So you can see very simply with one line of code, I said, okay, everything in this scene that has a tag, a game tag, and you can see here that these items do, right? Every game object in the scene, throw it into my array based on the tag. Okay, so that is find game object dot find objects with tag. Very useful. Load up multiple objects in your scene that have a certain tag. Alright, now here I have lights, so I have an array of lights, right? So what I want to do is say GameObject, find objects of type. Okay, now this works for objects that are of type, a light, a camera, a transform, or actually, sorry, not a transform, but a game object. Transforms and certain things like rigid bodies, I can't load those up based on objects of type. Why? Because they're components. They're not really types of objects. So they're a type of component, and I can get a component from a game object, but I can't load up objects of type rigid body because it won't find any. There's no objects of type rigid body floating around by themselves. They're attached as components to other objects. Okay, so what I do here is I say, okay, all types of objects that are lights, go ahead and load those up into my array. Right, so I haven't declared any values or even a length of it yet up here, but down here, once I make it equivalent to a function, which is GameObjects, find objects of type light, which is going to return an array, right, then those values will load themselves up into this array. And I'm going to hit play, and you'll see, boom, all the lights in the scene, and I have 3 that I've created, will load themselves into those slots based on the type of object, which is the light. Now the final thing is I want to get a list of all rigid bodies in the scene. Now this is a little bit tougher simply because I can't just load up every rigid body, every object with a component of type rigid body. So what I did here is I said for each game object being serious. Now what I'm looking for here is actually the rigid bodies in this, not in the entire game. If I wanted to do every rigid body in the game, I would have another variable here that was an array that said all obs equals something like GameObject dot something like get objects of type objects of type. It'll be GameObject. Something like that. And what that would mean is that I would have an array that basically had every item in the scene, and then I could iterate through those with for each and get every single rigid body in the scene. But for now, I'm happy to get all the rigid bodies that belong to this array, which is spheres, which I got with all the tagged items. Right, so I could say for each GameObject B, so this is just a temp variable. So every game object in my array of GameObject spheres, if B, which is my GameObject, I get component rigid body does not equal null. Now I put this in here so that I don't get any null values, because it can certainly find one, say, look, I'm going to add a rigid body even though there isn't one. It'll skip over it, but it will not delete an empty array. So I want to case this, just in case I come across one of those spheres, which is the case, that one of them does not have a rigid body. So it leaves a null value. I say rigids.add. Remember, this is coming from my list. This add, so I have a list, which means I can dynamically size it. So I'm populating my list with b.getComponent rigid body. So if this object has a rigid body, right, if GameObject has rigid body, add that rigid body to the list. And let's say append, because it goes towards the end. It goes at the end, actually. Alright. Now we hit play. And I have a list of the 4 rigid bodies out of the 5 in my scene. And it's the exact same size as the length, or it's the exact same size as the amount of rigid bodies in that list. Now, if I wanted to get all of them in a scene, then I would have to go through a list that had all game objects in a scene that were possible. Alright, short and dirty rundown on how to populate arrays and lists by using this GameObject.find objects with tag and GameObject get components of type rigid body or whatever it is you're looking for, and get objects of type, or find game objects with this type of object and populate an array with them. And we use these things a lot in games to kind of get lists when the game starts of stuff that I want to do things to later on. If I want to turn all the lights off at some point, I want to get a list of all the lights in the scene just when the game starts up, and at some point I can just say turn them all down or turn them all up globally. It's a nice way to populate these lists based on the type of object, based on the object tag, or the component of an object.